You wake up every morning with plans, big plans, the kind that could change everything. And then you go to bed defeated. Not because the world crushed you, because you crushed yourself. You built a cage out of what feels good, out of what feels easy, out of what feels safe. And now you're trapped in it. The same coffee shop every morning, the same route to work, the same excuses wrapped in different words. You call this stability. The universe calls it death. Your dreams are rotting on a shelf labeled tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes. Tomorrow is where ambition goes to die. You've convinced yourself that comfort equals success, that reaching a certain level means you earned rest. But rest turned into rust, and rust is eating you alive from the inside. The scariest part? You don't even notice anymore. The numbness feels normal. The mediocrity feels earned. The plateau feels like arrival. But deep down, in the quiet moments, you know you're capable of more. You know you're hiding. You know the real you is buried under routines, under predictability, under the weight of 1,000 small surrenders.
Your brain is not your friend here. Your brain wants you alive, not exceptional. Survival mode is its factory setting. Every time you reach for something different, it screams danger. Every time you consider a new path, it floods warnings. The amygdala fires up like an alarm system. Cortisol pumps through your veins, your heart races, your palms sweat, all because you thought about cold calling that client, all because you considered speaking up in that meeting, all because you imagined asking for what you deserve. The brain treats uncertainty like a predator, like death itself is knocking. But you're not being chased by a tiger, you're being chased by your potential. And your brain would rather you stay small and safe. Every familiar choice gives you a dopamine hit, that same lunch spot, that same desk setup, that same scroll through the same apps. Your neural pathways are carved deep into routine. The highways of habit are smooth and easy. The back roads of growth are overgrown and forgotten. Your brain rewards you for repetition, punishes you for deviation. This was useful 10,000 years ago, when consistency meant finding food and avoiding predators. But now it's the thing that keeps you ordinary. Neuroscience shows prolonged comfort kills cognitive flexibility. Your problem-solving muscles atrophy. Your creativity withers. You become a shadow of your capabilities, running the same program day after day, month after month, year after year, until you wake up and realize a decade vanished and you're still exactly where you were.
The trap is so subtle, you don't see it closing. You tell yourself you're being responsible, being practical, being realistic. These are just prettier words for being afraid. You've built an entire identity around your limitations, around what you can't do, around what's too risky, around what's not for people like you. Who decided that? When did you sign that contract? When did you agree to stay in your lane? The moment you stopped making yourself uncomfortable. The moment discomfort became the enemy instead of the teacher. Every successful person you admire made discomfort their home. The artist who quit the stable job, the entrepreneur who risked everything, the athlete who trained when everyone else slept, the writer who faced rejection after rejection. None of them waited until it felt right. None of them waited for permission. None of them had it figured out. You think courage means fearlessness. Courage means doing it while terrified, moving while every cell screams stop, speaking while your voice shakes, trying while failure seems certain. You've been waiting for the fear to leave. The fear never leaves. You just learn to move with it, to carry it, to use it as fuel instead of as chains. But you can't do that from your couch. You can't do that from the same coffee shop. You can't do that by refreshing the same feeds. The comfort zone is a beautiful liar. It promises rest, but delivers decay. It promises peace, but delivers regret. It promises security, but delivers stagnation. You wanted a break. The break became a lifestyle. You wanted to catch your breath. You stopped breathing altogether. You wanted to enjoy your progress. Progress reversed while you weren't paying attention. Skills you once had are now gone. Confidence you once felt is now doubt. Fire you once carried is now ash. And you're wondering what happened. What happened is simple. You stopped choosing growth. You started choosing ease every single day in 1,000 tiny decisions. Snooze instead of rise. Scroll instead of create. Complain instead of act. Dream instead of do. Each choice feels insignificant, but they compound. You're not failing in one big moment. You're failing in 1,000,000 small ones. Death by 1,000 comfortable cuts, and the bleeding is so slow you don't notice until one day you do. Until one day you wake up and realize you've been asleep at the wheel of your own life. Cruise control on a road to nowhere. The GPS keeps saying you've arrived, but you haven't arrived anywhere worth being.
You need to disrupt everything. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, not when you feel ready. Today, right this second. The version of you that exists today was designed yesterday, by yesterday's choices, by yesterday's fears, by yesterday's surrenders. You want a different tomorrow? Build a different today. That starts with breaking what feels normal, what feels safe, what feels comfortable. The cold shower you avoid every morning? Take it. Not because it's pleasant, because it teaches your nervous system a lesson. Discomfort is not danger. Discomfort is growth. The route you drive without thinking? Change it. The lunch spot you default to? Find another. The friends who only talk about the past? Distance yourself. The shows you binge to avoid thinking? Turn them off. Every small disruption is a declaration, a statement to your brain. You're not running this show anymore. Consciousness is taking back control. The autopilot that's been flying your life? Grounded. You're at the controls now, and the first thing you do is shake everything up, because comfort has become quicksand, and you've been sinking. You have zones you protect fiercely. Emotional zones, social zones, professional zones. These zones feel like home, but home has become a prison. You won't speak in public because it's uncomfortable, so opportunity passes you by. You won't have hard conversations because it's uncomfortable, so relationships stay shallow. You won't pitch your ideas because it's uncomfortable, so your potential stays locked inside. You won't start the business because it's uncomfortable, so you stay employed by someone else's dream. You won't end the relationship because it's uncomfortable, so you waste years on the wrong person. You won't move cities because it's uncomfortable, so you stay where you're miserable. Every zone you protect is a dream you kill. Every boundary you refuse to cross is a ceiling you accept. You think you're protecting yourself. You're suffocating yourself. Strategic discomfort means identifying these zones, mapping them out, then systematically destroying them. Not recklessly, not stupidly, but deliberately, with intention, with purpose, with the understanding that your growth lives on the other side. The presentation that terrifies you? That's your target. The conversation you've been avoiding? That's your battlefield. The skill you've never developed because it's hard? That's your mountain.
Disruption isn't chaos for chaos' sake. Disruption is surgery. You're cutting away the dead tissue, the habits that serve no purpose, the routines that drain energy, the relationships that diminish you, the thoughts that keep you small. You're not breaking things to break them. You're breaking them to rebuild better, to create space for what you actually want, for who you actually are. Not the you that's settled, not the you that gave up, not the you that plays it safe, the you that's been clawing at the walls, begging for release, screaming to be unleashed. That version exists. That version is real. That version is waiting. But that version can't emerge from comfort, can't emerge from routine, can't emerge from the life you've built around avoidance. You need to burn it down. Not literally, not destructively, but completely. The identity you wear like armor, the story you tell about your limits, the excuses you recite like scripture, all of it needs to go, because none of it is true, none of it serves you, none of it reflects your actual capacity. You're operating at a fraction of your capability, running on fumes when you have a full tank.
There are people who are exactly where you are, stuck, scared, spinning in circles. They made one decision, one brutal, terrifying decision, to stop accepting their current reality. The accountant who hated her job for 8 years finally quit with no backup plan, now runs a 6-figure coaching business. The guy who never spoke up in meetings, forced himself to pitch every week, now leads the entire division. The woman who stayed in her hometown afraid to leave, moved across the country alone, built the life she always imagined. The entrepreneur who failed 3 times, launched a 4th, scaled it to 7 figures. None of these outcomes were guaranteed. All of them required walking into the unknown, into the uncomfortable, into the terrifying space between who you are and who you could be. Every single one started with fear, massive, paralyzing fear, but they moved anyway. They disrupted their patterns anyway. They bet on themselves anyway. And the fear didn't disappear. They just got better at functioning through it, at using it, at transforming it from an anchor into fuel. You have the same option, the same choice, the same potential. But potential without action is just daydreaming, just fantasy, just another way to waste your life.
The people around you will resist your disruption because your growth makes them uncomfortable. Your change reflects their stagnation. Your courage highlights their fear. Your movement exposes their paralysis. So they'll tell you to slow down, to be realistic, to think about the risks, to consider what you have to lose. But you know what you have to lose. Everything you haven't become. Everything you're capable of. Everything you'll regret on your deathbed. That's what's at stake. Not the comfort you'll sacrifice. Not the routines you'll abandon. Not the approval you'll lose. Your actual life. Your actual potential. Your actual reason for existing. You don't need permission from anyone. You don't need consensus. You don't need encouragement from people who are too afraid to disrupt their own lives. You need to decide, once, firmly, irrevocably, that you're done with comfort, done with safe, done with small, done with the version of you that accepts less than everything you're capable of. That decision changes everything. That decision is the line between who you were and who you become.
Discomfort is not the exception. Discomfort is the lifestyle. Growth is not a destination you reach. Growth is the constant state of becoming. The moment you get comfortable with your new level, you've already started declining. The moment you think you've arrived, you've stopped moving. The moment you celebrate too long, you've lost your edge. This isn't pessimism. This is reality. This is how excellence works. This is how mastery is maintained. You don't climb the mountain and then relax. You climb the mountain and find a taller one. You don't achieve the goal and coast. You achieve the goal and set a bigger one. You don't reach a milestone and retire. You reach a milestone and accelerate, because the person who stops growing starts dying, slowly, imperceptibly, but inevitably. You've seen it, the person who peaked in high school, still telling the same stories. The entrepreneur who had one success, living off that same glory. The professional who got comfortable at their level, now obsolete. You don't want that. You can't want that. You have to choose the harder path, the path of continuous disruption, of continuous growth, of continuous evolution. Not because it's fun, because it's the only path that leads to fulfillment.
Your current routines are killing your future. Every morning you hit snooze, you're teaching your brain that comfort wins. Every night you binge content, you're teaching your brain that distraction is acceptable. Every time you avoid the hard conversation, you're teaching your brain that safety matters more than truth. Every time you choose easy over growth, you're carving those neural pathways deeper, making them stronger, making change harder. Your brain is learning from every decision, every tiny choice, every moment of weakness, every moment of surrender. It's all data, it's all programming, and you've been programming yourself for mediocrity, for comfort, for stagnation. But you can reprogram, starting now, starting with the next decision, the next uncomfortable choice, the next moment you face fear and move anyway. Every time you choose discomfort over comfort, you're building a new you, stronger, more capable, more resilient, more unstoppable. Each small victory compounds. Each uncomfortable action makes the next one easier. Not easy, easier. The cold shower gets slightly less shocking. The public speaking gets slightly less terrifying. The hard conversation gets slightly more natural. But none of it becomes comfortable. And that's the point. You're not trying to make discomfort comfortable. You're trying to make discomfort home.
You're going to fail multiple times. You're going to try new things and fall flat. You're going to disrupt your patterns and realize some patterns actually worked. You're going to push past comfort and sometimes regret it. This is not a reason to stop. This is confirmation you're doing it right. Failure only happens when you attempt, when you stretch, when you reach beyond your current capacity. The person who never fails, never tries, never grows, never becomes anything more than what circumstance made them. You will stumble. You will doubt. You will question everything. You will wake up some mornings wondering if you made a mistake, if the old life was actually better, if comfort was actually the answer. Those moments are the test. Those moments separate the people who transform from the people who talk about transformation. When doubt creeps in, you push harder. When fear rises up, you move faster. When comfort calls you back, you run further away because you know the truth now. You know what's at stake. You know what happens if you return to the cage. You've seen the other side. You've felt what growth feels like. You've tasted what becoming feels like. And you can never unsee it, can never unfeel it, can never go back to accepting less.
The anti-routine framework is simple. Whatever you did yesterday, do differently today. Not randomly, intentionally, with purpose, with the understanding that every repeated pattern is a rut, and ruts become graves. You take the same route to work? Take a different one. You eat the same lunch? Try something new. You work out at the same time? Switch it up. You talk to the same people? Expand your circle. You consume the same content? Cut it off. You think the same thoughts? Challenge every single one. This isn't about being chaotic. This is about staying sharp, about keeping your brain plastic, about refusing to let autopilot run your life. You're not doing this to be difficult. You're doing this to stay alive, to stay present, to stay in control.
Because the moment you stop paying attention, the moment you coast, the moment you assume you've got it figured out, that's the moment you lose. To complacency, to comfort, to the slow death of routine. You need challenge, you need uncertainty, you need the slight anxiety that comes from novelty. Because that anxiety means you're awake, you're engaged, you're actually living instead of just existing.
You've been telling yourself you'll start when conditions improve, when you have more money, when you have more time, when you have more support, when you have more clarity, when you have more confidence. Conditions never improve. Conditions are what you make them. You're waiting for permission that will never come. You're waiting for certainty that doesn't exist. You're waiting for fear to leave that never will. So you wait and wait and wait while your dreams collect dust, while your potential remains untapped, while your life slips away in comfortable numbness. The truth? You already have everything you need. You have today. You have this moment. You have the choice to do something different, something uncomfortable, something that moves you forward. That's all anyone who succeeded ever had. A moment, a choice, a decision to stop waiting, to stop preparing, to stop researching, to stop planning, and to start doing. Messy, imperfect, terrified, but doing. Because action in the wrong direction is better than perfect stillness. You can course correct while moving. You can't steer a parked car. You can't build momentum from your couch. You can't become who you're meant to be by staying who you are. The breakthrough you're looking for is on the other side of the thing you're avoiding. That conversation, that risk, that leap, that decision. You know what it is. You've known for months, maybe years. It's the thing that makes your stomach drop when you think about it. The thing you push out of your mind. The thing you tell yourself you'll do later. That thing is your breakthrough. That thing is your next level. That thing is what's standing between you and the life you actually want. And you're avoiding it, making it bigger than it is, making it scarier than it is, making it impossible when it's just uncomfortable. Every day you avoid it, it grows, becomes more daunting, more overwhelming, more impossible, until the thought of it paralyzes you completely. But here's the secret. The thing itself hasn't changed, only your fear of it, your story about it, your belief that you can't handle it. You can handle it. You can handle anything. You've survived everything you've faced so far. You're still here, still breathing, still capable. This thing you're avoiding, do it this week. Not when you're ready. You'll never be ready. Not when it's convenient. It'll never be convenient. This week, before Friday, before you talk yourself out of it again. You're stronger than you think. You're more capable than you believe. You're more resilient than you've demonstrated. But none of that matters if you don't prove it, if you don't test it, if you don't push yourself to find out. You're walking around with untapped reserves, unused strength, dormant power, because you've never needed to access it, because comfort never required it, because safe never demanded it. You have no idea what you're actually capable of, because you've never been forced to find out. You've never pushed to the edge, never gone to failure, never tested your actual limits. You've just accepted the limits you imagined, the boundaries you invented, the ceiling you constructed. All of it is fiction. All of it is story. All of it crumbles the moment you actually push. The person who can do 10 push-ups thinks that's their max until they're forced to do 20. Then they discover 20 wasn't the max either. The person who believes public speaking is impossible until they're forced to present. Then they discover they can do it. The person who believes they can't start a business until they have no other option.
Then they discover they're actually good at it. You don't know your limits. You only know your fears, your assumptions, your untested beliefs. Time to test them. Time to find out what's real and what's imagination. The ripple effect of your disruption is massive, bigger than you realize. When you change, everything changes. The people around you notice. Your courage gives others permission. Your movement inspires their movement. Your breakthrough shows them breakthrough is possible. You think this is just about you, but transformation is contagious. When you stop accepting mediocrity, others around you question their own acceptance. When you stop making excuses, others around you hear how hollow their excuses sound. When you start taking action, others around you feel their own inaction more acutely. You become the standard, the example, the proof that change is possible, not just for special people, not just for the chosen few, for anyone willing to get uncomfortable, for anyone willing to disrupt their patterns, for anyone willing to bet on themselves. Your kids are watching, your friends are watching, your colleagues are watching. What you do matters more than what you say. Who you become speaks louder than what you preach. Your life is the message. Your choices are the sermon. Your transformation is the testimony. So when you disrupt your comfort, when you push past your fears, when you become who you're meant to be, you're not just changing your life, you're changing every life you touch. You're raising the bar for everyone around you. You're proving what's possible.
You have one life, one chance, one timeline. No rehearsals, no do-overs, no reset button. The days you're wasting in comfort are gone forever. The years you're spending in routine will never return. The potential you're leaving untapped doesn't roll over. This is it. This moment, this day, this year, this life. You don't get another one. You don't get to try again. You don't get to see what would have happened if you'd been braver, unless you're brave now, unless you choose differently now, unless you disrupt everything now. Time doesn't care about your intentions. Death doesn't wait for you to feel ready. Your deathbed doesn't give extra credit for potential, only for what you actually did, for who you actually became, for the risks you actually took, for the comfort you actually abandoned. Everything else is just noise, just stories you told yourself, just excuses you made, just dreams you never acted on. You want to matter? Disrupt. You want to grow? Disrupt. You want to become? Disrupt. You want to live instead of just exist? Disrupt everything. Starting today, starting this hour, starting this moment.
Here's what you do next. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you finish this video, right now. You identify one comfort zone, one pattern, one routine, one thing you do because it's safe, because it's easy, because it's what you've always done, and you break it today. You take the action you've been avoiding. You have the conversation you've been postponing. You make the call you've been dreading. You start the project you've been planning. You end the situation you've been tolerating. Whatever it is, do it today, before your brain talks you out of it, before fear rebuilds the walls, before comfort seduces you back. One action, one disruption, one step outside your zone. Then share it, write it down, tell someone, make it real, make it public, make it impossible to back out of, because accountability is leverage, and you need all the leverage you can get. This is your moment. This is your chance. This is your breakthrough, but only if you take it, only if you move, only if you choose discomfort over comfort, growth over safety, becoming over staying. You know what needs to happen. You've always known. Stop pretending you don't. Stop waiting for permission. Stop preparing to prepare. Go do the thing. Disrupt everything. Become who you're meant to be. The clock is ticking. Your life is waiting. Go.